Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Today, we are focusing on the diversity of the American colonial societies. You'll notice that we are focusing on Spanish America, as well as British and French America, and Brazil's influence on South America, as well as their influence in Africa. What I want to take a note of are the comparisons across the colonial Americas. You have quite the variation among the political, religious, and cultural traditions of not only the European colonial powers who came to these regions, but by the people who were already living there. All of the European colonies were designed to be mercantilist, and we'll get into what that means a little later. In Spanish, Portuguese, and French colonies, the economy was incredibly active, but in New England, you had smaller, self sustaining farms that developed their own markets. The Carolinas and Virginia, there's very large plantations with a mixed economic system. And one thing to keep in mind is the religious competition of the Reformation was imported to the Americas. The Columbian Exchange, what I want you to focus on, some pretty important things. We've got the coffee bean, which is important to me, but also you have grapes, horses, onions, pigs, rice, wheat, and sugar. That'll be very, very, very important later on, and maybe not for the best reasons that you're thinking of. Over here, we have chocolate, but in terms of staple products, we have tobacco. That will be a huge moneymaker. We have squash, sweet potatoes, regular potatoes. Too soon for jokes, guys. Just remember that. So, what is the Columbian Exchange exactly? You have European, Asian, and African food crops being introduced to the Americas. You have American crops, including maize, beans, potatoes, manioc, and tobacco, being brought to the Eastern Hemisphere. And the introduction of these new world food crops is thought to be one of the factors contributing to rapid growth in world population after 1700. The introduction of European livestock, including cattle, pigs, and horses, had a dramatic influence on the environment and the culture of the native people of the Americas. Old world livestock destroyed the crops of some Amerindian farmers. There's a huge environmental impact. Other Amerindians benefited from the introduction of cattle, sheep, and pigs, but no animal had a greater impact on native people than the horse. It increased the hunting efficiency and military capacity of indigenous North Americans in particular. And here, as you can see, the spread of the horse in North America, eventually reaching pretty much every single area. And there we have two ponies wearing a sweater because, hey, why not? Some demographic changes. The people of the New World lacked immunity to disease. It wasn't just new food crops and animals coming over, disease came over too. Smallpox, measles, diphtheria, typhus, influenza, malaria, yellow fever, and possibly even pulmonary plague caused catastrophic declines in the population of native people in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. If you've seen the movie Pocahontas, the Disney film or the live action one, I do believe it is smallpox that killed her. Similar patterns of contagion and mortality can be observed in the English and French colonies in North America. Europeans didn't use disease as a tool of empire, but the spread of old world diseases clearly undermined the ability of native people to resist settlement and accelerated cultural change. And when attacks were made, it also lessened their ability to defend themselves. So as you can see, another map of the Columbian Exchange, as well as the various sicknesses that are coming and going. So let's move on and talk about Spanish America and Brazil. So take a look at the territories claimed by Spain. And a new term for the day is viceroyalty. And these are areas that are under control of what's called a viceroy, basically a very powerful governor. And the viceroyalty of Brazil, obviously under Portugal's influence. And what I want you to take special note of, the silver mines, particularly Potosi. That will play a huge role later on. What they find, the Spanish and the Portuguese, is that while there is some gold, more money can be made by silver. So the Portuguese and Brazil. In the 16th century, Brazil was secondary to Portugal's efforts in the Indian Ocean. In the later 16th century, the Portuguese began to exploit Brazil more. Sugar plantations expanded into the northeast of the country. By 1800, there were about 150,000 African slaves in Brazil, which made up half of the colony's population. Brazil developed an administrative structure similar to that of the Spanish colonies. And as in the Spanish colonies, Catholic missionaries were important in spreading Portuguese culture throughout Brazil. African religions and culture were practiced throughout the slave populations of Brazil, and the largest and most powerful quilombo was Palmares from the early 17th century. And a quilombo is a Brazilian hinterland settlement that was founded by people of African origin. They're also called Maroons. The power of the church. And we're going to be on this slide for a while, so you might want to take a second, make sure your pen is full, crack your knuckles, crack your wrists. Okay, you've had enough time. All right, the state of the church. The Spanish crown tried to exert direct control over its American colonies, but they had some problems. There's a lot of difficulty with communication between Spain and the New World. And because of this, a situation develops where the viceroys of New Spain and Peru and their subordinate officials enjoyed a substantial degree of power. During the 16th century, the Spanish established a more centralized imperial bureaucracy over their colonies. They created the first viceroy of 4 viceroyalties in Mexico City in 1535. By 1603, Spain had the most powerful colonial empire. The governmental institutions established by Spain and Portugal were highly developed and very expensive. These rather costly bureaucracies that thwarted local economic initiative and political experimentation were sort of trial and error at first. After some years of neglect and mismanagement, the Portuguese appointed a viceroy to administer Brazil in 1720. In Spain, a very strict Catholic culture had been enforced by the Office of the Inquisition and through the Reconquista. The Catholic Church played an important role in transferring European language, culture, and Christian beliefs to the New World. Catholic clergy converted a large number of Amerindians, but many of them still secretly held on to their native beliefs and practices. The Catholic clergy also acted to protect Amerindians from some of the exploitation and abuse of the Spanish settlers. And one example is Bartolomé de las Casas. And he's a former settler turned priest, and he denounces Spanish policies towards the Amerindians. And he worked to improve the status of Amerindians through legal reforms, such as the New Laws of 1542. He also writes a letter demanding that the ill treatment of these people be stopped. It is not successful. Missionaries spread both religion and Spanish authority in the Americas. And throughout this, De las Casas continues arguing for the humane treatment. It is hard to understand and to comprehend how a church can perpetuate the message of violence from their home country, but it happened. And a lot of what happens to the Amerindians is incredibly brutal. And this leads to, and the exact number is unknown, but we're talking about millions of people who are dying from disease, mistreatment, being overworked. Amerindians mix their belief with Christianity. You have the worship of Mary as the Virgin Mother of Christ, allowing the Amerindians to incorporate a fertility goddess. And the cult of the Virgin of Guadalupe began in 1531 when a peasant, Juan Diego, saw a vision of the Virgin Mary. Gender relations by social roles varied by social classes. And Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who lived from 1648 to 1695, came from a modest family, but she was a child prodigy. And this allowed her to move up from one social class to the next. She learned to read Latin before she was 10. That is her at the top, by the way. She became a lady in waiting for the viceroy's wife in Mexico City, but then she decided to join a convent to continue her education. And she wrote many texts and poems advocating for the spiritual and intellectual equality of women. Her writings were denounced by conservative church leaders, though, and she was forced to sell her library in 1694, and she died a year later. Colonial economies. Let's talk about that for a minute. The economies of Latin America were dominated by the silver mines of Peru and Mexico, and by the sugar plantations of Brazil. The silver mine of Potosi, which is in modern day Bolivia, will come later. And this led, as you can imagine, to quite the dependence on mineral and agricultural exports. The economy of the Spanish colonies was dominated by silver because gold was not available, or there wasn't as much gold as originally thought, which became quite the surprise later on. Silver mining and processing required a very large labor force, and that led to environmental effects that included deforestation as well as mercury poisoning to the people who were actually mining for silver. In the agricultural economy that dominated Spanish America up to the 1540s, Spanish settlers used the forced labor system of encomienda, which is a grant by the Spanish crown to a colonist in America, and that confers the right of land, as well as the right to demand tribute and forced labor from the people living on that land. In short, I own the land, therefore I own you. And this was meant to exploit Amerindian labor. With the development of silver mining economies, new systems of labor exploitation were devised. And in Mexico, you have free wage labor, and in Peru, the mita system. And under the mita system, 1/7 of adult male Amerindians were drafted for forced labor at less than subsistence wages for 2 to 4 months of the year. It's basically temporary slavery. The mita system undermined the traditional agricultural economy. It weakened Amerindian village life, and it promoted the assimilation of Amerindians into Spanish colonial society. Because quite often, this 2 to 4 months became 7 months, 10 months. The Portuguese developed the African slave labor sugar plantation system in the American islands, and then set up similar plantations in Brazil. The Brazilian plantations first used Amerindian slaves, and then more expensive but more productive African slaves. And what was found was that the African slaves were immune, or at least more resistant to the diseases Europeans carried, because they had been exposed over the years with trade from Europeans, especially the Portuguese. But the Amerindians had never had any contact. Sugar and silver played important roles in integrating the American colonial economies into the system of world trade. And sugar, silver, and tobacco. So this is how the African slave trade to the Atlantic world begins. Now, what had happened before? The Spanish borrowed the Incan word for mita for their system of labor tribute. As we discussed before, the Inca system demanded labor from every household for common work. And the Spanish found this very convenient and profitable when it came to mining silver. Potosi had the greatest deposit of silver discovered in the Andes in 1545. And many people died. The process of removing the mercury from removing the silver extraction from ore, not done properly, can be fatal, and it was. Potosi became a major market for food, labor, and supplies. The administrative centers of the viceroyalties increased local trade and crops for market profit. And it's during this time that the Spanish build large estates known as haciendas, and they grow crops for sale, and they're not always food crops, they're often cash crops, especially tobacco. And even though sugar is delicious and goes great on pretty much everything, it's not exactly something that you need to survive, and you can't live off it. Spanish crown, the Spanish royalty, focused on extracting wealth out of the Americas, but they really weren't that concerned about developing them. All right, we're going to stop there for today. Tomorrow we'll pick up with society in colonial Latin America. So giving you a sneak peek of what to expect, talking about the new caste system in South America. So email me those questions, guys, and have a great night. Cheers.